All right, everybody. Well, I think we've given it about a minute or so, and so I've seen kind of people joining us, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. First of all, I really want to say thank you so much for joining us for this particular webinar. My name is Dr. Rebecca Gonzalez. I am one of the staff psychologists at the Counseling Center, and again, it's really great to have you all join us today. This webinar, it's going to be recorded and it can be available later if you need it. We'll also kind of post it on our website. But as I mentioned, I am a psychologist at the Counseling Center here at Texas State. And this particular webinar is going to focus on radical self-care for students of color. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started. At one point during this presentation, if you have any questions or anything for me, I will be taking questions kind of at the end of our presentation today. So if at any point you have a question or there's just something that you want clarification on, go ahead and use that Q&A button in your webinar option or in the Zoom options, and you can submit any questions that you might have to me. I will go ahead and answer any questions that do come up at the end of the presentation today. But again, if you have questions that kind of come up along the way, please feel free to use that Q&A function so that I can go ahead and read the question that you have, okay? So let's go ahead and get started. As I mentioned, this presentation again is going to be on radical self-care for students of color. So I'm going to go ahead and start off. Let's make sure that all right, there we go. So just a little bit of an overview, what we will be focusing on. Again, thank you so much for taking time to join us today to engage in this discussion on self-care for students of color. So today, what's on the agenda, I'm going to talk a little bit about racial trauma. And we'll be talking about racial trauma in terms of the impacts of racial trauma, the way that the effects that it has in terms of the physiological, emotional, psychological impacts of racial trauma. We will also talk about self-care. I know that self-care is a word that has really made it into the cultural lexicon. We kind of use it a lot. And so part of what I wanted to do is just frame a conversation on self-care based on, you know, as therapists, as counselors, the way that we kind of utilize self-care. Then we'll talk about this notion of radical self-care, excuse me. I'll define what radical self-care is, and then also just talk a little bit about some ideas for self-care. It's going to look different for everybody, but really what I wanted to do with this presentation was give you all very concrete, very tangible things that you can take with you and incorporate in your daily life. A lot of the things that we're going to be talking about are skills that we actually encourage our clients to use in therapy. So a lot of these are going to be coming from the psychological literature and just things that we know can be beneficial in terms of our overall wellness. In addition to that, we'll be talking a little bit about self-care for racial justice advocates. So students who are engaging in racial justice and social justice work, talking a little bit about burnout prevention and self-care specific to students who are engaging in advocacy. And then, as I mentioned at the end of the presentation, I'll try to leave a couple of minutes for any questions that might come up. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, you can just use that Q&A function to send me any questions that you have. Okay, so again, thank you so much for joining me for this presentation, and let's go ahead and get started, okay? All right. So we have experienced recent events that have highlighted the continued racism, oppression, and systemic violence that people of color experience in our nation. The psychological research has really shown that people of color continue to experience racism, systemic racism, oppression, and systemic violence. And the research also shows that there is a toll, a psychological, emotional toll that experiences with racism and oppression and discrimination can create and can have. And so when we use the word racial trauma can result from one experience or innumerable experiences of racism. And racism, we know, can present in multiple forms. It can present in the form of racial slurs, stereotypes, microaggressions, which are kind of the commonplace and very brief daily verbal indignities that we can experience as people of color that communicate negative attitudes about stigmatized groups. And so part of what we're really trying to kind of say today is that the research is clear that there is an impact on our wellness and our well-being when we experience racism, discrimination, and oppression. In addition to that, racial trauma can also result from experiencing our own, but also witnessing racism, discrimination, and violence against people of color. So when we think about racial trauma and the way that it manifests, there's actually been a lot of research in the psychological literature that has found that exposure to racial trauma directly and indirectly through media outlets, through social media outlets, can have an impact on our psychological health and our well-being. So racial trauma, they describe it in the literature as a cumulative experience. So every personal or vicarious encounter with racism can contribute to chronic stress. And so what ends up happening is that when people of color experience racism, it elicits their own personal experiences with racism. And it also includes that awareness of the long-standing history of racism directed toward people of color or toward people with the same or similar identities that we hold. So part of what I wanted to kind of highlight today, again, is that there is a psychological, emotional, and physiological toll when we experience racism or when we observe racism. So let's talk a little bit about, I mentioned this a couple of times that experience with racism results in racial trauma. And these are the symptoms that we can experience or that we can notice. So I want to break them down into kind of different subcategories. So the first area is in re-experiencing. So we can actually have flashbacks or intrusive thoughts of past events or anxiety when we are reminded of distressing events. There's also avoidance, where we will avoid people and places, and sometimes we can even deny that our experience was racism. It's a way of kind of avoiding or disconnecting. There's also hypervigilance, which can present in our body. It's this autonomic hyperactivity where we feel jumpy or easily startled. Or, there's just this sense of hyperactivity. It's difficult to fall asleep. It's difficult to stay asleep. And there's absolutely that kind of physiological impact that we can feel. Then there's the emotional piece, and that can result in depression, anxiety, irritability, always feeling on edge. So even emotional numbing, where we intentionally try to numb or disconnect from our feelings, which can kind of hinder our ability to experience the range of emotions. We can feel powerless, helpless. We can feel mistrust, betrayal, shame, and guilt. So there's really complex emotions that we experience if we are experiencing, or if we have encountered racism, if we are if we are experiencing racial trauma. And it can also present in terms of somatic complaints, so things in our bodies, so headaches, body aches, appetite changes, fatigue, respiratory complications. And these are just some of the symptoms, some of the things to kind of watch out for, especially if we've had experiences with racism, with oppression. Again, even observing these things can create some of these symptoms. So part of what the research is showing too is that there can be longer term effects. So it can manifest in things like physical pain or cardiovascular disease, hypertension, having what's called a higher allostatic load. So it's actually the distress that's activated when the stress response has been activated. So what's called the fight or flight or freeze mechanism, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But when we experience stress that is chronic, our stress system becomes kind of taxed, and our hormones can actually be imbalanced and can contribute to a lot of the physical illnesses that I listed here. So part of, again, what I wanted to do with this presentation is to recognize, again, some of the symptoms, some of the things that we can experience if we are, again, with our experiences of racism and oppression and what can kind of happen with racial trauma. But a big part of what this presentation is about is self-care. And so I found this definition that I really liked, and it really highlighted self-care as our efforts to maintain wellness, and that we initiate them and maintain them on an individual basis based on our needs. And so it's a way to care for ourselves, to help bring balance and focus and mindfulness to our lives. And it can be a wide range of practices and activities that we engage in for ourselves. These practices can be physical, emotional, spiritual aspects of our lives. They really depend on our own individual needs and our own individual experiences. So ultimately, it's finding this way to achieve a sense of balance with the mind, the body, the spirit, thinking, feeling, behaving, and that's really what self-care is. And I like to kind of use this way of thinking about self-care. I know you see like this boiling pot of water here, and I like to use this as a way to compare or to explain how self-care works best. So self-care is not necessarily activated or helpful in moments when our stress becomes overwhelming. And so I like to use this kind of comparison is that we can think about our emotional well-being. We can think about it as, you know, the water that's inside of this pot, and it's on a stove, it's on high, and it'll start to boil. Every time we experience something that is stressful, that is anxiety inducing, that is hurtful, it's like we're adding more water to this pot. And it will get to the point where we experience so many things that we're just going to get to the point where we reach the top and we boil over. And so part of the way that I like to think about self-care is that self-care is the steps that we take to intentionally scoop some of that water out of the pot. So every time we put more water in, we are intentionally trying to scoop some of it out. That's what self-care is. It's making room for, you know, more things to happen. It's making room for ourselves to really engage in those, again, like preventative efforts to, you know, to avoid moments where we're boiling over all the time. And so we really want to think about self-care as preventative. So something that we do every single day that becomes part of your daily routine. And I know that as students, that's really hard to do. I know that you are kind of, when you look at the pieces on your chessboard, there are lots of different things that you're doing. You know, you're going to school, you're working, you are, you know, trying to balance so many different obligations. And sometimes it can feel like I don't have time to engage in daily self-care. And I totally hear that. And so part of what I really wanted to do again with this presentation is to find really small ways that are very, very powerful to engage in self-care. So again, we want to think about self-care as preventative, as part of your daily routine. There is this term, it's radical self-care, and that's what we're talking about too. And so, as I mentioned, so many of you are playing so many different roles. You know, we're children, we're siblings, we're friends. You may even be going into a specific career path where you are going to be supporting and helping other people. And a lot of us, you know, make those decisions to do that. And part of what radical self-care means is that it's really important for us to care about ourselves, not as a form of self-indulgence, but as an act of self-preservation, right? So we want to make sure that we are able to take care of ourselves before we attempt to care for other people, you know? So we want to make sure that we're doing things to empty our pot of water before we can help other people. And so that is the spirit of radical self-care. So part of what can be helpful is to create our own self-care plan. I really like this image, and I use this a lot in therapy and in work with clients, because what it's doing essentially is it's laying out all of the different ways that we can engage in coping, that we can engage in self-soothing. And I like that it's kind of listed out this way because it shows kind of the different ways that we can engage in self-care and coping. So as I mentioned, each different box will have a different what we call domain of coping. And the first domain, which we'll cover more like in depth all of these a little bit more, but is self-soothing. So it's actually using your senses, your 5 senses to help comfort you, to help soothe you. And then there is distraction, which is taking your mind off of things for a while. So you want to be able to do those things like read books, engage with artwork, knitting, crafting, all of those things, music, movies are actually distraction, which is a domain of coping in and of itself. Then there's that domain of opposite action. So doing something that is the opposite of your impulse when you're feeling really overwhelmed. So engaging with things like affirmation, inspiration, doing something funny or cheering, that's that domain. Then there's the domain of emotional awareness. So tools for identifying and expressing your feelings. This can come in different forms, and we'll talk about different ways to engage in emotional awareness, but again, it's just this opportunity to express how you're feeling, to get support when you are expressing those emotions as well. Then there's the domain of mindfulness. Mindfulness is tools for centering or grounding yourself in the present moment. So these are things, again, like meditation, relaxation, grounding, doing things like yoga and breathing exercises. As I mentioned, we'll delve a little bit deeper into each of these in a minute. And the last step is always to have a crisis plan. So people who you can reach out to if you need to, friends, family, a therapist if that's something that you want to get started, psychiatry, hotlines, crisis support. And, when we think about our own wellness, sometimes we do incorporate, again, this crisis plan. Every self-care plan will be really different. Yours is going to be different from mine, and it's really going to depend on what your needs are and what your experiences are. And so I really encourage people to think about, when it comes to self-care, we might try something, decide that it's not helpful, and kind of move on to something else. And that's how we find the things that will eventually be helpful for us. So as I mentioned, these are the different domains of coping. And when we think about putting a self-care plan together, again, we want to think about it being preventative. So we want to do it before we get to that level of distress. We also want to think about it being daily, so something that's woven into your daily structure and that includes all of these different things. So let me talk a little bit more about specific strategies for self-care. So I'm going to do this based on a couple of different things. So the first strategies that I'm going to talk about are the physiological self-care strategies. So of course, the basic foundational principle of physiological self-care is to focus on meeting your basic needs. So things like eating healthy, exercising, staying hydrated, resting your breathing. A lot of times, especially in college, these are kind of the first things to go, again, because we have so many things on our plate. But kind of starting at our basic needs and getting those needs met can be really important, especially if we're dealing, again, with any of the physiological pieces related to racial trauma or stress that we're experiencing. Racial trauma can actually trigger the stress response. It's actually called the fight or flight or freeze response. And this mechanism it's designed to be this internal alarm system, right? It alerts us to danger. And when we have perceived danger, then a very specific sequence happens in our bodies, and it will create a very specific sequence of events. So when the fight or flight or freeze response is activated, the stress response, our body will flood with adrenaline. And this adrenaline will cause lots of things to happen in your body. It will start the heart racing, and you'll start to hear it really racing. You might feel hot and sweaty, maybe tingly. Sometimes your extremities will actually get cold. Sometimes you'll kind of have changes in appetite because like non-essential functions like digestion can actually slow down when we're in that fight or flight mode. Sometimes we can feel like we have tunnel vision or like all of our senses are heightening. So if we are in fight or flight or freeze mode, if somebody taps you on the shoulder, you're going to jump. If you hear a loud sound, then it's going to scare you because again, all of those senses are heightening. We're very hypervigilant in these moments. So part of what any really, really good self-care plan is to acknowledge that there is, a lot of physiological changes that are really prompted and maintained by that fight or flight or freeze response. And they are maintained by adrenaline, as I mentioned. So like adrenaline is coursing through your body. And there's actually an accumulative effect to adrenaline. So every time we experience something stressful, our body will secrete the adrenaline. And if we don't find ways to move it out of our system, the adrenaline, then we'll hold on to it, we'll store it. And then the next time something stressful happens, then it will add to our layers of, or to the amount of adrenaline that we're working with and that we experience. So part of any really good physiological self-care strategy is really adrenaline management and daily adrenaline management. It's a crucial piece to self-care. We get adrenaline out by crying it out and by sweating it out, by moving it out. So some of the hallmarks of things you can do every single day to help with the physiological self-care is exercise, walking, things like dancing, things like yoga, even just listening to music and like kind of stomping and having an angry walk if you need to. Anything you can do to help yourself move the adrenaline out of your system. Again, that's really the foundation of a lot of this, of adrenaline management. And there are other strategies for that too. One of my favorites, and one that I like a lot because you will always have this with you, is something called diaphragmatic breathing. Slow upper chest breathing is part of that typical stress response. So again, we're breathing kind of using our upper chest, and it will just reinforce that whole adrenaline system, and it'll reinforce that fight or flight or freeze mechanism. So the stress response can be reduced by conscious breathing using the diaphragm. So as you see in this image here, it's actually trying to engage your belly, your diaphragm, as you breathe. If you've ever seen a baby lying down on its back, you see that belly kind of going up and down, and that's what you want to replicate in the breathing that you're doing. Diaphragmatic breathing actually does help us control the nervous system. Again, when we're in fight or flight or freeze mode, when that stress response is activated, there's a lot of adrenaline. And so part of what this kind of breathing can do is to help you encourage your body to engage with the relaxation response. So again, you really want to think about using your belly and kind of having it go to inflate that as you breathe. This technique is called square breathing, and I like it a lot, again, as a technique that you can always have to use, in any moment. If you were starting your day out with breathing, or if you notice, I'm kind of doing that like upper chest breathing today, I'm going to try to do a little bit more of that square breathing. This is always something that can be really helpful. So square breathing, it happens, I have this image here because I think that it can be a really helpful image to kind of explain. So essentially what you're wanting to do is you're going to be using counts of 4. And you are going to inhale, and you're going to inhale and count up to 4. Then you're going to hold your breath for 4 counts. Then you're going to breathe out for 4 counts. And then you hold your breath for 4 counts. And so when you exhale, you want to make sure that you exhale through your mouth. You breathe in through your nose, exhale through your mouth. And when you exhale, you really want to envision like pushing a lot of the air out of your system. So you want to hear the noise. You want to hear as you actually try to push a lot of that air out of your system. So again, this is square breathing. Breathing in for 4, holding your breath for 4 counts, breathing out for 4, and then holding your breath for 4 counts. And you can repeat this a couple of times, and you can even envision the square as you do it. So again, this is a kind of breathing that actually helps to trigger that relaxation response. Another one that I really like is the 4-7-8 technique. And this is diaphragmatic breathing that can actually, it increases oxygen in your body, and it does encourage a resting heart rate. So if you have a lot of those physiological symptoms that we talked about, breathing can be really powerful, again, to try to trigger that relaxation response. So the 4-7-8 is simple. You breathe in for 4, you count up to 4, you hold your breath for 7 seconds, and then you breathe out and make it last for 8 seconds. This again is a kind of breathing that is actually going to try to encourage that resting heart rate. It's going to encourage relaxation. And so even, as we go through this presentation, I encourage you to try it. Like, just give it a try. Again, breathing in for 4 through your nose, holding it for 7, and then exhaling through your mouth for 8 counts. And this again is a kind of breathing that will help soothe your heart, that will help manage those levels of adrenaline. Ooh, I clicked forward, didn't mean to do that. Okay, so let's talk about grounding. Grounding is a technique that we use to help turn attention away from our thoughts, memories, worries, and focus on the here and the now. It's a strategy that comes from that mindfulness box, helping us get connected to the here and the now. When we're experiencing a lot of the symptoms that we talked about, the focus is on the future or the past. What grounding can do is to help get us connected to the here and to the now. And grounding was originated by people who would, go out and stand in the grass and take off their shoes and really feel the grass underneath their feet. And they would really take that moment to engage with their 5 senses. So this technique is something called, it's the 5-4-3-2-1 technique. It's a grounding technique. And what it's doing is it's helping you take in the details of your surroundings using your senses. And doing that can actually help you, again, be in the present moment to help soothe you using those 5 senses. So you want to think about, I missed one on here as I was typing it up. Sorry about that, but you want to think about 5 things that you can see. So close your eyes, open them, and look around in your environment and really look at the details of 5 things. Whether it's, the clock in your room or it's the trees that are outside of your window. Really look at the details. And 4 things that you can feel. Literally go up to 4 things that you can touch. It's helpful sometimes to have things like fidget spinners, if you really like those are really good grounding techniques. Fidget cubes that are cubes that you can use to fidget and kind of spin. And so 4 things that you can feel. If there are animals around you, go touch them. If there are stuffed animals that you can touch, then you can engage with those. So literally just try to focus on the sensation of feeling those things. Then there's 3 things that you can smell. It's helpful to have things around you that you can use again to create any feelings of self-soothing when you smell these things. And so you want to be able to smell tea if you're drinking tea, or have creams around that you can use to smell and just orient yourself to that. Then it's going to be 2 things that you can hear. So trying to close your eyes and trying to orient yourself to 2 sounds in your environment. If there's nothing in your environment, then maybe listening to your favorite song, or going outside and just listening to the sounds of the environment. Again, you really want to focus on the sensations that can bring you that self-soothing. And then 1 thing you can taste. So having something like a stick of gum or a mint or a raisin, a piece of chocolate that you can just focus on the way that it tastes. Again, this is called the 5-4-3-2-1 technique, using your senses to help ground you in the present moment. There are some other grounding techniques that I like as well. Again, part of what grounding is trying to accomplish is to help us be in the here and the now. And so one of my favorite grounding techniques is using categories. So essentially what you do is you choose at least 3 or maybe 1 category. And what you try to do is just name as many items in each category as you can. So an example would be telling yourself, okay, I need to take a grounding moment. I need to just help myself be in the here and the now. I'm going to think about the category of movies, and I'm going to try to list as many movies as I can. I'm going to take a couple of minutes and just try to list them out. Or I'm going to think of all of the colors that I can name. And you're creating this list for yourself. This grounding, again, will help you find mechanisms to be in the here and the now, but it also helps you disconnect from upsetting thoughts. If you are experiencing them, if you're feeling overwhelmed, it just occupies your brain in a different way. And so again, you think about the categories: countries, sports teams, really anything, especially things that bring you a lot of joy and laughter. Think about the category and then list as many as you can. Then there are some smaller grounding exercises that are just mental exercises. So some of the activities that I like are describing the step for a favorite activity that you know how to do really well. So let's say that you know how to make really good pancakes from scratch, and you close your eyes and you just walk yourself through the steps. Another one is to think of an object and try to draw it in your mind. So just close your eyes and envision the object that you're thinking of, and try to draw it in your mind. Try to create a visual image in your brain, in your mind. Another kind of mental exercise is to spell your name and the names of other people backwards. So again, you're trying to use your brain in a different way. You're trying to disconnect from overwhelming feelings, overwhelming emotions. So that's grounding. Another strategy that is my favorite is something called progressive muscle relaxation. Progressive muscle relaxation is a way that we can teach our bodies to relax by relieving stress by slowly and progressively tensing and then relaxing your muscles in your body. As I mentioned, that physiological response can cause like muscle constriction. It can cause a lot of tension that we hold in our bodies. Progressive muscle relaxation is designed to be a way to help us, again, we're progressively tensing and then relaxing our muscles one group at a time. This allows for tension to flow away from your body. And, you know, it really does kind of help. Again, we want to trigger that relaxation response in our body. You can go on YouTube and find like 10-minute progressive muscle relaxation strategies. You just kind of pop in your earphones, you listen along, and someone will guide you through. But I've included some really quick progressive muscle relaxation strategies that you could use that are really targeting the specific areas of the body where tension and stress can really accumulate. So I've targeted the shoulders, the arms and the fists, and then the head. So as you see, the steps are kind of lined out here. So with progressive muscle relaxation, again, you're tensing and then progressively relaxing your muscles. So really quick, what you can do is you can take your hands and then squeeze them, make them really tight. Again, you want to really feel those muscles tightening. Hold it for a little bit, give yourself about 5 seconds, and then you can like let your hands go. And then you actually feel that when you release, you can actually shake your hands and feel, you know, the relaxation kind of moving through your hands and through your arms. You can also do it on your shoulders. So you literally just raise your shoulders up towards your ears and you tighten them as much as you can. You really try to hold that tension, and then you just kind of let your shoulders drop. And again, what you're doing is you're tightening and then you're releasing those muscles, which will try to trigger that relaxation response. You can even do it with your head, and you can do it using your eyebrows. So if you raise your eyebrows, again, up and high as much as you can, hold that tension for a little bit, and then tightly close your eyebrows and close your eyes, and then open them up. You are, again, you're tensing those muscles, and then you are relaxing them, and it allows you to feel that sense of relaxation when you need it. I mentioned that when it comes to physiological self-regulation, things like exercise, things like, you know, finding those opportunities to move some of that adrenaline out of your system are really important. And some of these things that I mentioned, so breathing, allowing yourself to engage with breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, grounding, I like them because they're things that you always have with you, that you can always use when you need to. Check in with yourself, see how you're feeling, and you can implement them again whenever you need to. Let's transition to emotional self-care strategies. What I have on here is something called the cognitive triangle. And I wanted to kind of introduce this as a way to talk about when we do experience racial trauma, anxiety, depression. There are lots of explanations about why anxiety and depression happen. But this one is one that I think can be really helpful in terms of understanding our emotional needs. So this comes from something called CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy. And ultimately what it's saying is that things like anxiety, things like depression are caused by the relationship between these three things. So our thoughts, what we're thinking about, they have an automatic impact on our feelings, our emotions. And so our feelings and our emotions dictate the way that we behave. And they're all connected, and it's all a cycle. So if we think about, if we're thinking about experiences of racism, of oppression, of discrimination, the emotions that can result are things like sadness, things like depression, things like guilt and shame. And so emotions that are really overwhelming for us. And so when we think about emotional self-soothing, we want to think about acknowledging, again, what the emotions are, what we're thinking about that has created those emotions for us. And then what I like about this is that it works both ways. So we can actually engage in certain behaviors that help us self-soothe our feelings. So if our feelings cause our behavior, then behaviors that are, again, self-care behaviors can do a lot to soothe our feelings, to soothe us emotionally, and to soothe the thoughts that we're having too. So when we think about emotional self-care, again, it's really common if we have experienced or viewed situations of racism, of oppression, of discrimination, that we experience sadness, anger, resentment, rage, depression, and to allow yourself to express your emotions, whatever that means for you, whether it's talking about it or engaging with your art or writing or, finding those opportunities, whatever it is for you, and surrounding yourself with people who give you a safe space to process your emotions. Journaling can be really helpful for this, whether it's writing it out or writing notes on your phone. Finding a way to externalize your feelings through journaling, through any of those other activities can be really helpful too. Engaging with spiritual practices, if that's something that's important for you, and engaging in activities that you enjoy, that make you happy, that bring you a sense of connecting with your deeper value system. Those are really important. Another thing to keep in mind is that a lot of times when it comes to self-care, it's learning how to set boundaries when we need to. And I know for a lot of us, boundaries can be really hard. And I really want to validate that it can be hard to assert our needs and to set boundaries when we need to. But we can do that even in really small ways. So if we need to take a break from videos, from the news, from social media, again, there is vicarious trauma that we can experience watching those things. So if we need to take a break, it's okay, to find those spaces to focus on your own needs. And then finding ways to reduce our mental load when we need to. So kind of looking at all the pieces that you have in your chessboard and what you have to do that day, and seeing if there are things that we can take off and responsibilities that we can either do later or, that we can say no to, taking on new responsibilities. So being able to check in with ourselves in terms of the things that we have on our plate. It's also really important to feel connected, right? So I really love on our counseling center website, the clinicians here have created this awesome list of lots of different things that we can do to feel connected. They have podcasts on there that you can listen to that focus on self-care, that focus on issues relevant to people of color, to students of color. Finding opportunities to connect with people who share your similar identities, like being able to talk to people who can have those conversations with you, who can understand and validate your experience. It's really important to be able to have those spaces too. Getting connected with a mentor or being a mentor to somebody. That's really a great way for you to, again, create that sense of connection with others. There are support groups on the website too that are like national support groups, things that are being done over Zoom. At the Counseling Center, we're hoping to next semester start a support group for students of color, and so we're trying to create those spaces here as well. There are also so many groups on campus that you can join to, again, meet people with your similar identities. And I know that a lot of people are getting really creative about, again, navigating those chances for connection in the midst of this pandemic. So there are opportunities to really connect with people and to connect with people who share your identities, who share your experiences, who can validate what you're feeling and what you need. As I mentioned, part of this presentation was really going to be geared to, to students or those of you who might be engaging in racial justice advocacy. Advocating for social justice is one of the most rewarding things that we can do. And it takes a lot of selflessness, a lot of empathy, a lot of compassion. And because it's so multifaceted, the work that you do as a social justice advocate, it can be physically and emotionally draining, again, because you're accessing this empathy, this compassion. And so part of what can be helpful for us if we are engaging in social justice or racial justice advocacy is to be aware of what the signs are of burnout. So burnout has been defined as encompassing a lot of the things that we already talked about, a lot of the physiological and emotional things that we talked about. But burnout specifically is marked by, again, that sense of physical or emotional exhaustion. It can also be marked by a sense of cynicism or feeling detached, or feelings of like what we're doing is ineffective, or not kind of feeling a sense of accomplishment in the things that we have accomplished. Those are the specific markers of burnout. And so I found this list of questions that was put forth by the Mayo Clinic that I really liked a lot. And it's questions to ask yourself about burnout. And it's again, very specific things that you can check in with yourself to see, like, are these things that I'm experiencing? Are these things that are going on for me? Because then you can use that as your own self-assessment of, am I experiencing burnout? Do I need to incorporate some more self-care? Do I need to be able to get additional support? So again, some of these questions are, do you feel like you drag yourself to work or have trouble getting started? Do you lack the energy to be consistently productive? Is it hard to concentrate? Are you feeling disillusioned? Do you feel like you're using food, drugs, alcohol to help you feel better? Has your sleep changed? Have your sleep habits changed? Are you experiencing things like headaches or stomach or bowel problems or other physical complaints? I like, again, that these questions really let us determine for ourselves what we're experiencing and what we might be needing. And so I just kind of wanted to put those questions out there as a way to check in with ourselves, especially if you are engaging in racial justice work. Ways to avoid burnout. So some things, in addition to all of the things that we discussed, all of those things are applicable. Again, it's that radical self-care, caring for ourselves as we care for others. We want to maintain healthy, friendly relationships with fellow activists and non-activists. So really having a really strong support group, people you can reach out to. And again, if you feel like you're needing to build that support group, you're not alone. And it can be helpful to reach out, again, to a therapist or groups on campus or mentors, really finding those opportunities and trying to create that social support system. Living one day at a time and realizing that the work that you're doing is a lifetime job, and really trying to stay as much as you can, again, in the here and the now. I really like to keep a gratitude journal. A gratitude journal is at the end of the day or at the start of your day, whatever works best for you, you just write down 3 things that you're grateful for. And they can be small things. It can be, the sun was shining, or it didn't feel like it was 1,000 degrees outside today, or, I got to connect with someone I hadn't seen in a while. Writing down the things that you feel grateful for. Earlier, when we talked about the relationship between our thoughts and our feelings, if we intentionally try to kind of connect with things that we're grateful for, it's going to elicit a lot of really positive emotions for you. And so I like, again, to keep a gratitude journal. Exercise is really important. Again, we want to recognize that the physiological impact of the work that you're doing and working some of that adrenaline out of your system. Taking stock of your obligations, and learning how to say no when you feel like you have too much on your plate. Again, saying no to those obligations can feel really hard because we want to be able to help everybody and do all of these things. But again, we want to ask ourselves those questions of how am I feeling? What am I needing? And it's okay to say no to obligations and set boundaries when you need to. So the last step that I really wanted to talk about, again, being a mental health therapist, I really feel like therapy can be an important space if you want it to talk through your experiences, to process your feelings, to get support. And I really want to encourage people to think about, like, if you want to go to therapy to talk about racial trauma or your experiences with racism, with oppression, that you want to make sure that you find a therapist who's a really good fit for you, and a therapist who you can have those conversations with, and really say, like, this is the focus of what I want to talk about. And so what you can do is, there's part of what we do in therapy is we really try to have culturally informed therapy or care. And so we really want to be mindful of the identities that someone brings into the room, and you know, really use those as important parts of the therapy experience. And so I found this list of questions. So a list of questions that you can use to ask a therapist, or to process these experiences with, or as you're looking for a therapist to talk about issues of racial justice or racial trauma. And some of these questions are, you know, how does your background impact your work? Or what's your experience working with, you know, any specific population? So any particular identity that you hold, and you can ask about that. How do you work with clients who've experienced racism, discrimination, or immigration-related concerns? So asking questions. What does it mean to you to provide culturally competent care? What training have you had? What's your comfort level in talking about race and discrimination, systemic oppression? And sometimes, especially if you're wanting to do this kind of work in therapy, it can be helpful to have those conversations, and to be, again, mindful of that as you go through and do your work in therapy. Again, our counseling center has created this awesome list of resources for students. And so I really encourage you all to go and look on there. And if you are looking for a therapist who may hold your particular, you know, any identity that you want to see in the therapist you meet with, then we've put together a lot of resources and places that you can go. And again, like, the counseling center is always available if you have any of those questions, or if we can be of any support. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we've kind of come to the end here. And I do, again, want to create a space if there's anybody who has a question or wants clarification on anything. I can go ahead and look at any questions that you submit through the Q&A function. So there's a little square at the top of, or the bottom of your screen when you go to, like, the muting and stopping video, and there is that Q&A section. So if there are any questions before we're done for today, then I'm gonna give a minute to see. I don't see any in my list right now, or in my docket right now, but I want to give just a minute if anybody has any questions. Well, I'm not seeing any questions. But again, if you have any questions, or if you need any clarifications on things we talked today, I am at the Counseling Center. Please, you know, get in contact with me, or anybody if you have any questions about the services that we provide. Oh, I have one question. Will there be a space for staff or faculty of color as well? So I guess I'm wondering, like, if this is specifically at our counseling center. I think part of what we're trying to do is really make our services accessible to everybody. And so I haven't heard of any initiatives right now, but I know that we're always trying to kind of look through what the next options would be, and, you know, options for creating those spaces. So I think it's definitely, like, part of our conversation. But, you know, in terms of planning for future semesters, I'm not too sure about that one. But again, it is something that we're really wanting to be mindful about as well. On our website, though, there are lots of resources that are national resources, or more community San Marcos resources, or Austin, San Antonio. And so a lot of those are available to staff and faculty as well. So thank you so much for that question. And let me see if there are any more that are coming through. So it looks like that was the question that we received. So thank you so much for taking the time, again, to participate in this webinar. If you have any questions or anything like that, you know, at the Counseling Center, you can always get in touch with us. And it was really a privilege to, you know, share this information with you today. And yeah, I'm going to go ahead and put stop on this. But again, thank you so much for your time. And everybody take care.